Okay. Yes, it looks like it's recording.
Hooray.
Great. So first of all, let me thank you for this thrilling opportunity. I totally loved your book, and this is such a rewarding conversation for me, and I hope it will be for you as well.
Thank you. Thank you for doing it.
Well, this is your debut novel, How Much of This Heals is Gold, and rarely have I seen a debut taking the world by storm with such rave reviews and such a list of important accolades. Were you prepared for this kind of exposure?
No, I mean, to be honest, it still feels a little bit surreal, in part because, my book came out in April 2020 in the US right after California lockdown. So
Yes.
in the more than a year since, all these things have happened, but they sort of happened in the digital world, right? Like, I got to be on this late night talk show, but we filmed it when I was sitting on my couch, and I still haven't walked into a bookstore and seen my book. So it just kind of feels imaginary to some extent. It's a funny feeling.
Well, talking about that, one would say that 2020 may have been the worst year to come up with a book, especially an author's first. How was it for you?
The thing is, in some ways, my anxiety about having a first book come out in the world may have been lessened because I had anxiety about so many other things. Like, I remember, at the beginning, I suppose I should have been worried about sales, but I was actually even more worried about the existence of, independent bookstores. I was like, will the bookstores survive? Because as important, I think, as the first year of a book's life feels, in reality, when I think back, on all the books that have really moved me or reached me, I've read them 20, 35, 50 years after they were written. And I think that's one of the important things about writing a book, is that it lives a really, really long life beyond your life. So I was much more consumed with anxiety about, whether people would live, whether independent bookstores would exist, etc.
Yes, on the other hand, looking at the bright side, if we can find such a bright side, there's been this time when people stayed home more and subsequently read more, hopefully.
Hopefully, though, I've also had a few cases where I've talked to readers, or I suppose potential readers, where they kind of feel, I think, apologetic, like, oh, I haven't finished it yet, or I'm really excited to get to it. I'm like, oh no, nobody should be apologizing for not being productive in this year. It's like, if the only thing your brain could handle in a time of global crisis was, right, watching reruns of the Great British Bake Off, do that. Like, again, the books will be here in 10 years, they'll be here in 50 years. It's not, right, it's not a competition to read everything as soon as it comes out and to read as much as possible. I think this past year I've been really, really cautious of applying what is frankly a very capitalist mindset toward literature, right? That's not how it is. It's not a race of like how many we sell, how fast, and how much we read, and like how many words are entering our mind. This is a little bit tangential, but I'm sort of thinking about, in recent years, there's been all this sort of drama surrounding these apps that promise to like take a piece of writing and like condense it so that you can like get the gist of a whole book in 30 minutes. Right. And I'm just like, why? That's not the point of literature.
That's really a refreshing perspective. Well, like I told you, I must confess that I have loved your book, but then again, I guess you've already heard that hundreds and hundreds of times. So I'm going to reverse the question. Do you love your book?
That's such a tricky question. I love it, and I'm proud of it, and I think I love it in a very different way than I did when I was writing it, right? It's been really refreshing to see it through the eyes of readers, and something that I've been asked a lot is, who I wrote this book for, and the first answer was always, I wrote it for me, right? I think that writing ultimately has to begin as a selfish endeavor, because you have to surprise and delight yourself first. I mean, it takes so many years that if you don't have that effect on yourself, it's not going to work. And I do think that thinking too hard about like who's going to read it, who's going to buy it, punctures that sort of intimacy that you have in the writing process. But this year, that answer has changed a little bit, because I think that I wrote it sort of for me, but for me as perhaps a little bit of a younger person, as, you know, an Asian American girl growing up in a country where I felt a little bit lonely and a little bit anxious about my place, and hearing how it's connected with other Asian American women or girls who had that same lived experience has sort of made me a bit more courageous in saying, you know, I wrote this for us. And so it's allowed me to love my book in a new way, to sort of take up more space more boldly, to say like, I wrote this for us. I wrote this to enter and break the American canon of the Western. I have a different relationship with the book now.
Well, I think my next question links organically to your answer. The book came out of your own experience of, I wouldn't necessarily say immigrant, but rather migrant life during your childhood and your teenage years. Apart changing homes and being constantly on the road, what do you recall as being the dominant feeling back then?
Yeah, it was really this feeling of do I belong and where do I belong? You know, on the deepest level, being a family of Chinese immigrants, you know, you can't take race out of the question. It isn't so much that I set out to write a book about racism, so much as that is so deeply intertwined with my personal experience and with the experience of so many people that you can't just decide to, you know, put it in or take it out of a narrative in that way. But on a, you know, on a more universal level, I think that anyone who's moved around a lot as a kid, anyone who's felt marginalized in any way, right? I was talking to a friend who's white, but her family was of like a lower social class. And so she actually had many similar experiences of just feeling out of sorts, not quite fitting in and sort of at the very young age you are in childhood, as the characters in my novel are, of often taking that feeling and turning it on yourself, right? You start to wonder, like, is it something I've done? Not, oh, maybe we actually just live in a problematic society which expects everyone to adhere to these the same normalized standards.
Well, you were born in Beijing, but you self-define yourself as equally American. Now, this cultural and spiritual binomial is also one of the spines of your book, a Western haunted by Chinese motives, where one can find implausible tiger paws traces. Do you yourself feel at a crossroads of cultures and roots inside yourself?
Did more so when I was younger. As you said, I was born in Beijing, and I actually did not become an American citizen until I was 16, when my mother, you know, was eligible to, and then I was therefore naturalized through her. I think I felt that sort of tug of war more strongly at a young age, but now, I mean, I've lived for most of my life in America, and I'm American, and this is an American book. More specifically, right, it is a Chinese American or an Asian American book, but those are American experiences. There's, at this point in time, I think there's nothing more American than the story of being an immigrant and trying to figure out how you reckon your experiences and sort of some of the culture that you've had filtered through your parents with your daily life. That, I mean, to be an American, at least, you know, as I've experienced it, like living in San Francisco, is to walk around and hear Vietnamese spoken casually, is to hear Spanish spoken casually in the streets, and to, you know, awkwardly use my high school Spanish to order in a taqueria, and to, you know, eavesdrop on Mandarin and Cantonese speakers. That is a quintessential American experience.
Now, I quote from one of your interviews. You say, fiction is a wonderful sandbox to explore extremes that we don't find in our lives. Now, what kind of life that you don't normally live has the novel allowed you to inhabit?
That's a very good question. I think that this life of I think a deeper connection actually to the natural landscape is one that is really interesting. So, you know, I would say that the landscape of the American West is as much a character in this novel as any other. And it's, you know, I've taken it to sort of like exaggerated extremes where the buffalo are enormous, where tigers exist, where, you know, storms come in and destroy entire towns, which I haven't seen myself, thankfully. And I think what's really funny about that is people often expect then that I am like, you know, a rugged hiker or camper or whatever. And I'm not. I'm actually very scared of the natural world. But, you know, I think about this sort of Kantian notion of beauty being something that vibrates between the poles of awe being something that vibrates between the poles of beauty and fear, right? Because it's something so immense that you kind of can't quite hold it in your mind. And that's what the natural landscape is to me, particularly in a place like California, where I think it's impossible to walk around without some knowledge of how much damage humans have done to it, how much it's been changed by the imprint of human hands, right? Every single year that I was working on this book, wildfires have broken out in California. There's been drought. And I think that one of the extremes this book allowed me to explore was the extremity of having sort of your nose pressed up against that change instead of being able to sort of sit back, as we often do today in the privileged of us in our urban environments, and sort of be protected from some of the enormous climate devastation.
The book is bold and speaks of realities that are common ground today, but were almost tabooish as 1.5 century ago. When depicting a character like Sam, for instance, how do you integrate him in that kind of social environment that you describe?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I suppose I'll just like clarify first by saying that Sam is somebody who is assigned.
I wasn't going to give too many spoilers.
It's okay. It's only spoiled.
Yeah.
It's only spoiled like 15 pages. But Sam is somebody who today would probably be considered, you know, transgender or non-binary or gender fluid. You know, the thing about that is, I think often when people ask me that question, they expect that it was difficult, right? Because it was uncommon to find transgender or non-binary people, but the thing
spoken of, at least.
Yeah, it wasn't difficult at all, because you know, one project of this book is to take this time period that's been set down in this very specific way in our sort of cultural memory and in our history books, but to also recognize that recorded history is very, very narrow, right? And it's recorded by people in power who have an agenda, who have a desire to erase, you know, people of color and immigrants and queer people and impoverished people, whatnot. So the thing about that is, transgender and queer people have been around since the dawn of human time. And indeed, you know, before, in many sort of pre-colonial cultures, there were much more fluid traditional ways of seeing gender, right? I think about, you know, Indian culture traditionally, or many native cultures, which have this concept of like two-spirit people. And so I think that, yeah, it wasn't hard. It was just like, these people have always existed, and people like Sam have always existed.
Now, The Guardian highlighted your novel, calling it the boldest debut of the year. Did you feel bold when you have started writing it?
There were times during the editing process, I think, when I sort of stepped back from the project and saw the number of things that it ended up doing, where I did feel that sort of boldness. But I think, again, in the very first draft, I can't think about, are people going to call it bold? Are people going to call it timid? And I had the sort of luck to have started this novel when I was living outside of America, in Thailand, for a year, at a time when I had, I only had one friend in the city. I was sort of kind of had hit restart a little bit, or pause on my life. And so it was a context in which I sort of had fewer voices in my head and in my life than I might otherwise have. And so, you know, the project came to me. I just like woke up one day and had this image of this landscape and these two characters in my head. And I just wrote, sort of without thinking about it, without doing anything except pursuing just like the pleasure and the excitement of writing into something I didn't yet know the end of.
Whose validation did you need when writing the book?
That very first draft, no one but my own. I finished the first draft rather quickly, and I did not show it to anybody for another at least 6 months after I finished it. I think for me, what's really, really important for a nascent project is that you need to acknowledge as a writer that first drafts are ugly, first drafts are bad, they're full of plot holes, they're full of confusions. And I think you do a disservice to your book if you show it to someone when it's still, to sort of clunkily borrow the metaphor of a baby, when you show it to someone before it's like able to stand on its own, right? It'd be like, I guess I'm going to just pursue this terrible metaphor, but like it'd be the equivalent, right, of like taking an overly early stage novel and being like, hey, look, what do you think of this novel? But someone thinks it's like, and it's an infant, right? It can't do anything. It can just like cry and shit. But somebody might think it's supposed to be 2 years old. Like, well, it doesn't walk yet, right? And this, like, its knees look weird and its head is still soft. And you're like, those early opinions aren't actually getting at the heart of your project. They're just sort of inviting doubt and criticism way, way, way too early. You have to wait until you have taken the time to make sure that your novel, even if it's not perfect, is at least walking, is at least its sort of coherent self before you invite another set of eyes in. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm totally with you in this metaphor.
Okay, good, because it was very confusing.
Now, in my opinion, the book is also a deconstruction of the American dream. Was it some sort of an intellectual response to the tearing of many American dreams during the Trump years?
So I actually finished my first draft in 2015, in like the summer or spring of 2015, before Trump was elected into office. So it wasn't a direct response to his administration. And indeed, looking back now on it having come out in 2020, this year of huge spikes in anti-Asian hate crimes in the US and in other places, it felt a little bit creepy. It felt like I had kind of predicted this. And I remember in 2015, when I finished this book, I had this moment of like crisis, like, oh, the fact that there is sort of naked violence against the family in this book, is that going to be read as like, in the Obama years, is it going to be read as like too grotesque, too dramatic, unrealistic? But I think what I was picking up on was that the currents of this kind of racism had always been there my entire life, right? The violence makes headlines today, but the violence is just a sort of a slightly more visible extension of my daily experiences of people, continuing to ask me, where are you really from? Of people leaning on harmful stereotypes of the model minority, of people sort of, masking racism in the form of what they think are compliments, like, oh, you must be so good at math, or your family must love to eat this certain kind of food. So I think so yes, in a way, it's a response to all of that, because all of that has been there my entire life. All of that has been there for decades and centuries.
What would you say is the biggest misconception when addressing the immigration matter?
In the book, or in?
No, in general, yeah.
Yeah, I think, oh my God, there are so many, but I think maybe what I would say foundationally is just very simply this idea that immigrants are any different at their heart than anyone else, right? You referenced earlier this idea of the American dream, which, I would sort of summarize as this pull yourself up by your bootstraps opportunity, that it doesn't matter how wealthy your parents are, or if you came from nothing, you can succeed if you work hard enough and believe enough and put in the work, right? That American dream applies to no one more perfectly than it does immigrants, right? Immigrants are people who, as in my parents' case, were fleeing a place where their opportunities were restricted. They were looking for freedom of choice, for freedom of expression. And that's just, I think that, as cheesy as it sounds, if you actually sat down an immigrant family and like a white person from the Rust Belt, I think they would actually find that they have a lot in common. And I think that's the most fundamentally the most incorrect and one of the most dangerous rhetorics. It isn't about like necessarily even about being we're all different and we need to figure out ways to cross that divide, though that's true too. But like I think fundamentally we're all more the same than we are different. And the true enemy is not one another, right? It's not immigrants coming and taking the jobs. It's the fact that we have billionaires and capitalists sitting at the top of the pile who would rather pay everyone less. They don't care actually what your race is at the end of the day. They just care about sort of like sucking as much money out of this and resources out of the system as possible. And those are the actual enemies.
Well, judging what seems unknown or unusual to us seems so easy, even today, despite decades of efforts to broaden our horizons and leave prejudice behind. Do you think that these pandemic years will erupt into more accentuated, more extreme attitudes?
I don't know. I actually will just say that I haven't really thought beyond the pandemic time, so I don't really have an answer to you. I do think we are in this sort of crucible of great change, right? The fact that so much of our social order has been ripped up, the fact that I think so many people are seeing today that the systems that we thought were working for us are truly, truly broken. I think we will see a lot of change. I have no ability to predict in which direction that will go, but I'm slightly hopeful, I suppose.
The book also sprang out of your grief over losing your father when you were 22. Can fiction help one make peace with this kind of loss?
I think it's dangerous to think about the act of writing itself as a cathartic act. And in fact, I have one of my friends, the essayist Kira Madden, wrote a really beautiful essay called Against Catharsis, right? Writing fiction is not journaling. That said, I do think that for the reader of fiction, not the writer, there can be reading fiction about experiences like yours can help you, because I think one of the powers of a fictional narrative, right, is the ability to see the world through someone else's eyes, and then after that coming back to your life and sort of kind of having those glasses on of a different perspective and sort of being able to frame aspects of your own life through that other person's eyes for a little bit. And so in that way, I think it can be useful. So it's like, I don't think that my writing about a dead parent helped me necessarily in my own grief, but certainly when I was grieving, reading, right, like Joan Didion's a memoir about losing her husband, that helped me, or reading obviously I can't clearly can't think of them all on the spot, but right, yes, reading totally. Other people's writing about these kinds of losses and the fact that they were different than mine was actually very useful.
From a whole array of reactions to your novel, which one do you remember as particularly striking or emotionally intense?
I'll give you a sort of fun one.
Okay. So, fun is welcome.
Fun and striking. So recently an Asian American woman reached out to me and said that after reading my book and listening to the musician Mitski's album called Cowboys, when she hears the word cowboy these days, the first thing she thinks of is an Asian girl. And that's just amazing to me, because again, part of my entire project of this book is to shove my way into the canon, to break open the canon where you think of the American West, you think of expansion, you think of cowboys, and you always think of this like swaggering Clint Eastwood style white man who's just like, yes, taking things over. And the fact that that's already changed that in one person's head is just, it's incredible to me.
Now, a more predictable question, perhaps. What character or part of the book do you especially relate to?
I think that I would say out of all, there's a little bit of myself in all the characters, but probably Lucy is the one, yes, who I relate to, or rather, going back to that idea of my writing the book for maybe a younger version of myself, that the younger version of myself would relate to, right? One of the things that sort of really troubles Lucy throughout the novel is this fantasy of assimilation into whiteness, right? She is sort of the classic, the model minority of the book, the classic good girl. She really thinks that if she keeps her head down and does all the things right, that can fully protect her from this broken, abusive system that is just racist at every turn. And you know, one of the tragedies of her arc through the book is that, as often happens, I think, with Asian Americans in America, you turn that toxicity on yourself, right? It harms your own self-image. It's like deeply, deeply painful to walk around and have this vision of yourself, internalized vision of yourself as lesser, as always trying to be somebody different.
Up to the age of 18, you have changed like 10 homes, I think. Now, home is really where the heart is.
I think so. I just like, if anything, this past year, with the pandemic, like we moved again, and I think that in this past year, it's come to feel like, what is location, what is geography, right? We're all just virtual heads bobbing around in digital space anyways, and it has sort of reminded me of something I have felt for a lot of my life, that yes, obviously I deeply miss being able to like have dinner with my friends and hug them and speak to them in person, but all my most endearing relationships have been ones that have persisted, you know, despite geographical boundaries. Like my best friend, I obviously haven't seen her this year, but even before the pandemic, we had already spent many years living on different coasts of the United States. And so I don't really know where I will end up in another year, but I think friends and loved ones make up the sense of home as much as any sort of physical place.
That's a beautiful answer. Now, you know, they say it's not that hard to come up with a brilliant debut novel, but the real challenge is to deliver an equally compelling second book. Now, how do you relate to this quip?
Do they say that? I'm glad I'd never heard that before. Yeah, I think that it's harder to get other people out of your head. Again, like, I don't think this novel was possible for me without that sort of, even if imagine sort of like veil around myself when I was living in a place where I was very isolated. But yeah, I mean, I don't really know what to say. It does feel like every time you start a new writing project, you're sort of learning to write all over again. And I have the feeling that it will never be the same way again. I did finish another book, and it is the complete opposite of this book. And I think for me, that's the only way to proceed, is to try to, again, always surprise yourself and find something that's like new and weird and challenging to do the next time.
Great. Now, thank you so much. It's been really a wonderful experience talking to you, as was reading the book. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much. This was really fun.
Okay, bye. Take care.
Bye.